The truth has a way of choosing its own moment. The words left Vanessa Cole's lips with the polished calm of a host who had spent 15 years controlling live television. But tonight, even she could feel something sharper moving beneath the studio lights. The red on-air sign burned above camera 2. White light washed over the glass desk, over the polished floor, over Ethan Whitmore seated in a charcoal suit that fit him like reputation itself. At 39, Ethan was the face of Whitmore Global, the white billionaire CEO America trusted to talk about leadership, legacy, and the values that built empires. His smile was measured, practiced, every angle designed for headlines by morning. Across the giant LED wall behind him, the segment title glowed in gold letters: Family, Power, and the Future. The audience clapped on cue, soft and synchronized, while Ethan adjusted the silver cufflink his late mother had once given him and answered another question about discipline, excellence, and what he called the architecture of trust. Millions were watching from penthouses, airports, suburban kitchens, and late-night bars from New York to Los Angeles. He looked untouchable. That was when the camera shifted. Near the third row, a woman slowly stood. Nia Brooks. Her dark skin glowed beneath the cold white studio lights, not because she sought attention, but because dignity had a way of catching light on its own. Her navy dress was simple, elegant, untouched by the vanity of the room around her. In her left hand, she held the small fingers of a little girl no older than 5. Ava. Tiny braids tied with silver stars rested against the child's shoulders as she blinked up at the stage, calm, curious, unafraid of the world staring back at her. A murmur rolled through the audience like wind over glass. Vanessa hesitated, the slightest pause only professionals could detect. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully, eyes flicking toward the woman. "It seems someone here believes your story began earlier than the public knows." Ethan turned. For the first time all night, his smile changed. Not vanished. Tightened. His eyes landed on Nia, and something unreadable passed through them. Before the cameras caught it, the room seemed to shrink around the silence. Nia said nothing. She simply met his gaze with the quiet steadiness of a woman who had survived the cost of truth long before tonight. Ethan's voice came low, clean, almost bored. "I don't know this woman." The sentence hit the studio like dropped glass. The audience gasped. Vanessa's producer shouted in her earpiece to stay on it. Camera 1 punched in tighter on Ethan's face. Every controlled breath now magnified on screens across America. Nia did not flinch. She didn't argue. She didn't lift a hand in protest. Her fingers only tightened gently around Ava's. It was the child who moved. Ava tilted her head, studying Ethan with the open curiosity only children carried. Then, in a voice soft enough to sound harmless and clear enough to stop the room, she spoke. "Tiny stars always tell the truth." The silence after that was not ordinary silence. It was the kind that rearranged lives. Ethan's breath caught so subtly most viewers would miss it, but the camera did not. His jaw locked. His fingers froze against the glass desk. That sentence, those exact 6 words. No press conference had ever quoted them. No biography had ever mentioned them. No board member, investor, ex-lover, or reporter had ever heard them. Because those were the words Evelyn Whitmore whispered every night beside a bedroom window in Boston when Ethan was 5 years old, when she pointed at the stars above Beacon Hill and told her son that no matter how powerful men became, the truth would always outlive them. His pulse thundered in his ears now, louder than the applause signs, louder than the hum of cameras, louder than Vanessa saying his name. Across the nation, millions leaned closer to their screens as Ethan Whitmore, the man who never lost composure, stared at the little black girl beneath the lights as if he were looking straight into the only part of his past he had never buried successfully. Ethan Whitmore had built his entire life on control, but in that studio, beneath the sterile white blaze of live television, control slipped from him one breath at a time. Vanessa Cole's voice softened, careful and deliberate as, if even she understood that one wrong word could shatter what remained of the night. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, leaning slightly forward behind the glass desk, "that phrase clearly means something to you." The camera stayed close on him. America watched the smallest fracture appear in a man famous for never cracking. Ethan did not answer right away. His gaze stayed fixed on Ava. The little silver stars tied into her braids caught the light every time she shifted, tiny flashes that pulled him somewhere he had not allowed himself to visit in decades. A narrow brownstone bedroom in Boston. Frost tracing delicate lines across the window in winter. His mother's soft hands wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. Tiny stars always tell the truth, Evelyn Whitmore would whisper while pointing at the night sky above Beacon Hill. It had been their ritual, their private language, born from nights when his father was gone on business, and the house felt too large for a lonely child. No one knew that phrase. No one except the woman who had died before Ethan turned 22. His throat tightened. In the third row, Nia Brooks stood still, calm as ever, her dark eyes unreadable beneath the lights. She was not smiling. She was not triumphant. Her silence carried something far heavier than revenge. It carried certainty. Across the control room, producers scrambled. Social media monitors exploded in real time. Hashtags multiplied by the second. Whitmore Live. Secret Daughter. Tiny Stars. The nation was no longer watching a polished interview. They were witnessing the first public crack in a billionaire's mythology. Vanessa turned gently toward Nia. Would you like to explain how your daughter knows those words? Nia's voice, when it came, was low and steady, built for truth rather than spectacle. I never taught her that phrase, she said. The audience shifted, a ripple of disbelief and curiosity. Ethan's eyes snapped to hers. For the first time that night, there was something naked in his expression. Fear, yes, but something deeper too. Memory. Nia continued, never raising her tone. 3 years ago, before your company's expansion to Atlanta, before the Forbes cover, before the speeches about legacy, there was 1 week in Boston. A storm shut down half the city. Your driver never made it. You walked 6 blocks in the snow to the bookstore where I was closing alone. The studio vanished for Ethan. He could smell coffee and old paper again. Hear the hiss of sleet against the front windows. See Nia, younger, wrapped in a gray wool sweater, her laughter warming a room the storm had emptied. 1 week. 7 nights of conversations about ambition, grief, and the strange loneliness of people who always looked successful from a distance. He remembered telling her about his mother, about the stars, about the phrase he had never repeated to another living soul. His pulse pounded harder. When I found out I was pregnant, Nia said, resting a protective hand lightly against Ava's shoulder. You had already changed your number. Your legal team had buried you behind 3 assistants, and your board had moved you out of Boston. Her words were not sharp. That was what made them devastating. They carried no anger, only the clean weight of history. Ethan's hand tightened around the edge of the desk. He remembered that season now with brutal clarity. The emergency succession battle after his father's stroke. The board demanding distance from anything that could be framed as distraction. The new image consultants. The relocation. He had let the machinery of power erase a human week that had clearly never stopped living somewhere else. Ava looked up at him again, her wide brown eyes carrying the same thoughtful stillness he had seen in mirrors as a boy. Mommy says stars come back when people are ready, she said softly. The audience exhaled as one. Ethan's composure broke not in words, but in the slow way his shoulders dropped, as if the empire sitting on them had suddenly become too heavy to hold. Vanessa's voice came through the silence, almost a whisper now. Mr. Whitmore, is it possible this child is yours? Ethan stared at Ava, then at Nia, then at the millions of viewers beyond the cameras. For the first time in his public life, the answer he gave was not built for shareholders, headlines, or damage control. It was built for the truth he had just heard in his mother's voice. I do not know yet, he said, each word raw and stripped of polish. But I know she should never have had to stand here alone. And somewhere in living rooms across America, the story stopped being about scandal and became something far more dangerous to a man like Ethan Whitmore: accountability. The moment the live broadcast cut to commercial, the studio did not relax. If anything, the silence grew sharper. Crew members moved fast beneath the overhead lights, headsets buzzing, producers whispering into microphones as trending numbers climbed higher by the second. On the giant monitor in the control booth, Ethan Whitmore's face remained frozen in replay, his expression shifting from certainty to disbelief the exact instant Ava spoke his mother's phrase. Across the country, news channels were already pulling the clip into split-screen debates, legal analysts speculating, family bloggers framing it as karma, finance anchors warning that Whitmore Global stock had dipped 4% in after-hours trading. But inside the studio, none of that noise touched the small circle forming around Nia Brooks and her daughter. Nia knelt beside Ava near the aisle, smoothing the silver star clip in her braids with gentle fingers. "You did good, baby," she whispered. Ava looked up with the calm seriousness only children could carry. "He looked sad, Mommy." Nia paused, the words landing somewhere deeper than she expected. Before she could answer, Ethan stepped down from the stage. Gone was the polished distance of the interview chair. Up close, under the less forgiving spill of studio lights, he looked less like a billionaire icon and more like a man catching up to years he had outrun. His charcoal jacket hung open now, the silver cufflink at his wrist slightly crooked, the first visible imperfection America had probably ever seen on him. He stopped several feet away, careful not to intrude on Ava's space. "Nia," he said quietly, her name sounding unfamiliar in his own voice, as if memory itself had to relearn it. She rose slowly, placing herself between him and Ava, not out of hostility, but instinct. The line of her shoulders was protective, practiced by years of raising a child without certainty from anyone but herself. "Do not do this because cameras are still nearby," she said, her tone calm enough to make every word land harder. Ethan glanced toward the nearest lens, then to the darkened audience where phones still glowed. This stopped being about cameras the moment she spoke. His eyes moved to Ava again. The child was studying him with the same thoughtful stillness that kept disarming him. She was not afraid. That, somehow, shook him more. Vanessa Cole approached, no longer wearing the smooth neutrality of a host. Off air, she looked almost humanly moved by what she had witnessed. "The network wants to offer you both a private room," she said to Nia. "The entire country is going to spend the next 12 hours talking about this. You should not have to walk through the press line alone." Before Nia could respond, another voice entered the moment. "She will not." Damian Cross stepped out from the side corridor, tall, composed, his navy overcoat still dusted with the cold mist of Manhattan outside. CEO of Cross Meridian Capital and Whitmore's most visible rival, Damian carried the kind of presence that made hallways quiet before he even spoke. He had been seated in the back executive row all evening, invited for the following segment, but now his timing felt almost surgical. His gaze settled on Nia first, then Ava, offering reassurance without overstepping. "My security team is already downstairs. No one gets near them without permission." Ethan's jaw tightened, not with jealousy, but with the sharp awareness that another powerful man had stepped into a void he himself had created. Damian turned toward Ethan, his tone smooth but edged. "Tonight is not about your image, Whitmore. It is about whether truth still has room to breathe around men like us." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Nia looked from one billionaire to the other, unimpressed by either form of power. "I did not come here for rescue," she said softly. "I came because my daughter deserves a story that begins with the truth." Ava reached for Ethan then, not fully, just one tiny hand lifting toward the silver cufflink glinting at his wrist. Her fingers brushed it with innocent curiosity. "Pretty," she said. Ethan's breath caught. It was the same cufflink his mother wore pinned inside her scarf on winter nights in Boston, the same heirloom he had not let anyone touch in years. Nia noticed his expression shift again, something softer this time, something dangerously close to regret. Damian stepped aside, sensing the emotional gravity of the moment. Vanessa's producer signaled that the show would resume in 90 seconds. Another live segment. Another choice. Ethan looked at Nia, then Ava, then toward the glowing stage beyond the curtains where millions still waited for the next sentence. "Come back out there with me," he said, voice stripped of every executive layer. "Not for television. For the beginning she deserved 5 years ago." Nia held his gaze, the studio lights reflecting in eyes that had learned long ago the difference between performance and truth. For one suspended second, with the countdown clock ticking and the nation waiting, she had to decide whether the next step would expose a lie even deeper than the one already shattered. The countdown clock above the stage bled red numbers into the dim corridor. 90 seconds. 89. 88. Each second felt louder than the city beyond the studio walls. Nia Brooks stood still, Ava's small hand wrapped around her fingers, while Ethan Whitmore waited in front of her with the kind of stillness that only came when a man had finally run out of rehearsed versions of himself. Behind them, crew members rushed past with clipboards and headsets, but the world inside that narrow strip of light had narrowed to one question. Would truth survive the next live segment? Nia's eyes held his for a long moment. She had spent 5 years learning not to confuse urgency with sincerity. The difference had kept her and Ava safe. You do not get to turn her first truth into your redemption story, she said softly. Ethan did not look away. I know, he answered. And for once there was no boardroom steel in his voice. Only the rough honesty of someone standing in front of the consequences he once outsourced to silence. Then why now? She asked. The question was not sharp, but it cut deeper than accusation. Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing toward Ava, who was now tracing the edge of his silver cufflink with quiet fascination. Because when she spoke, I heard my mother's voice clearer than I have in 17 years. And because for the first time tonight, I realized the part of me I protected most was the exact part one abandoned in both of you. The words settled between them. No music, no audience applause, no scripted host transitions, just the sound of a truth arriving late. Damian Cross watched from several feet away, his expression unreadable, hands folded over the handle of his umbrella like a man who understood storms better than most. Vanessa Cole's producer called from the wings. Back live in 60 seconds. Vanessa herself stepped closer, lowering her voice. If you walk back out there, the nation will decide what this means before any of you finish speaking. Be sure you are walking toward truth, not panic. Nia looked down at Ava. Her daughter's face was calm, almost luminous beneath the spill of backstage light. Mommy, Ava whispered, tugging lightly on her hand. Why does he look like the picture in your blue box? Ethan's breath stopped. Nia's composure shifted by the smallest degree. The blue box. A memory she had kept hidden on the highest closet shelf in her Atlanta apartment. Inside it, an old bookstore receipt from Boston, a dried winter rose pressed between pages of a poetry book, and one Polaroid of Ethan standing by a snow-streaked window, smiling in a way the world had never seen on magazine covers. Ava had found it months ago while looking for holiday decorations. Nia had never explained more than, that was someone from a long time ago. Ethan stared at the little girl, and in her question he heard the impossible tenderness of years he had missed. You kept that? He asked, his voice barely above a breath. Nia met his eyes again. I kept proof that once, before the empire, you knew how to be human. The studio manager raised 5 fingers from the wings. 5 seconds until they returned live. The curtains beyond the hallway glowed with stage light, bright and merciless. Ethan extended his hand, not toward Nia, but toward Ava, palm open at the level of her small reach, leaving the choice entirely hers. The little girl looked first at her mother. Nia gave the smallest nod. Ava slipped her hand into his. Ethan's expression changed so subtly it might have escaped everyone except the millions waiting beyond the lens. Something in him softened, not into certainty, but into the first fragile shape of accountability. Together, they stepped toward the stage. The applause sign lit up as Vanessa resumed her smile for America. But this time the atmosphere was different. Gone was the polished interview energy. In its place stood something rawer, more magnetic. Ethan took his seat, but he did not sit alone. Nia remained standing beside Ava at the edge of the desk, not behind him, not beneath his narrative, but beside the truth itself. Vanessa turned toward the camera. We are back, and what happened moments ago has already become the most replayed live television moment of the year. Mr. Whitmore, before the break, you said this child should never have had to stand here alone. What happens next? Ethan looked at Ava's hand resting in his, then at Nia, then directly into the lens that had once been his shield. What happens next, he said slowly, is the part of my story I was too afraid to tell when it mattered. In boardrooms across Manhattan, Whitmore executives froze in front of screens. In Atlanta, neighbors in Nia's apartment building leaned closer to their televisions. And somewhere in the nation's collective silence, a deeper question began to rise. One far more dangerous than scandal. Who had helped bury the truth 5 years ago? And why did the Whitmore board seem terrified that Nia had come back into the light? The studio lights no longer felt like part of a television set. They felt like a courtroom built from glass, electricity, and millions of watching eyes. Ethan Whitmore sat straighter than before, but the confidence America had always associated with him had changed shape. It was no longer the confidence of a man managing perception. It was the fragile steadiness of someone finally stepping into the part of his own history he had let others control. Ava's small hand still rested in his, her silver star braids shimmering every time she tilted her head toward the giant LED screens behind them. Vanessa Cole leaned in with the measured calm of a woman who understood exactly when a live interview had become national reckoning. "You mentioned fear," she said. "Fear of telling the truth when it mattered. What exactly were you afraid of?" Ethan's jaw tightened, not from resistance, but from the effort of opening doors he had welded shut years ago. 5 years ago, after my father's stroke, Whitmore Global was in the middle of a succession crisis, he said. The board had already split into factions. One side wanted me as chief executive officer immediately. The other wanted a sale. Across the country, finance channels cut into the live feed, pulling up old footage of Whitmore stock crashes and emergency board meetings from that year. Ethan continued, his voice slower now, stripped of polish. My legal team changed my number, rerouted my mail, and moved me from Boston to New York in less than 48 hours. They told me it was temporary. Strategic. They said anything personal from that week could be used as leverage. Nia stood beside the desk, her face unreadable, but her stillness deepened. She had always suspected silence had not come from nowhere. Hearing the machinery named aloud made the memory colder. Vanessa turned toward her gently. Did you ever try to contact him after Boston? Nia's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. 3 times. I called the number he gave me. It had been disconnected. I mailed a letter to his townhouse in Beacon Hill. It came back unopened. Then I sent one final envelope to Whitmore headquarters in Manhattan. Ethan looked up sharply. I never saw any of it. The words landed with enough force to shift the room. In the executive viewing lounge 30 floors above Midtown, several Whitmore board members were now watching in complete silence, faces lit by the same live feed they had once relied on to protect the company's image. One name in particular sat heavier than the rest. Charles Whitmore, Ethan's uncle, interim chairman during the crisis. The man who had insisted family distractions could collapse investor confidence. Ava looked between the adults, her brows knitting with the innocent seriousness of a child trying to map adult pain into something understandable. Someone hid Mommy's letters? She asked softly. Ethan's throat tightened. He nodded once, unable to offer her anything cleaner than the truth. I think so. Vanessa, sensing the emotional center of the moment, pressed carefully. Do you know who? Before Ethan could answer, a producer rushed toward the stage edge and slipped a tablet into Vanessa's hand. Her eyes widened, then sharpened with the unmistakable focus of breaking news. We are receiving this in real time, she said, turning the screen toward Ethan. On the display was a scanned image of an envelope. Nia's handwriting. The date from 5 years ago. Received, Whitmore Executive Office. Initials, CW. The entire studio seemed to stop breathing. Ethan stared at the initials as if they had just redrawn the architecture of his past. Charles Whitmore. His uncle. The same man currently serving as chairman emeritus. The same man who had publicly preached legacy, discipline, and family stewardship in every shareholder letter since. Nia's eyes flickered once, not in triumph, but in the quiet devastation of finally seeing proof that the silence had not been fate. It had been a decision. Vanessa's voice lowered. Mr. Whitmore, are those your uncle's initials? Ethan's face changed in a way no investor call had ever forced from him. Betrayal. Not theatrical, not explosive. The colder kind that arrives when old loyalties suddenly make sense in the worst possible way. Yes, he said, every syllable precise. That is Charles Whitmore. In penthouses, airport lounges, and suburban living rooms, America watched the scandal widen from personal denial into corporate obstruction. Damian Cross, still standing near the wings, folded his arms as if the first half of a chess match had just confirmed itself. Nia looked at Ethan, not as the billionaire on magazine covers, but as the man standing in the same storm she had survived alone. Now you know what it felt like, she said quietly. Ethan met her gaze, and for the first time, his expression carried no defense at all. Only the devastating clarity that the people who taught him how to protect the empire had also stolen the only truth that might have made him worthy of it. And as the live feed pushed the envelope image onto screens across the nation, one question rose louder than the stock alerts and legal analysts already flooding cable news. If Charles Whitmore buried Nia's letters, what else had the board hidden in the name of legacy? The envelope image stayed suspended across the giant LED wall behind the stage, Nia's handwriting magnified larger than life, the black ink now more powerful than any legal team press statement Whitmore Global could issue before midnight. The initials CW glowed in the lower corner like a confession dragged into the light. Ethan Whitmore stared at it, every polished instinct inside him colliding with a truth he could no longer delegate away. Vanessa Cole did not rush the silence. She let America sit in it, because this was no longer just a story about a hidden child. It was about the architecture of legacy itself. Ethan finally exhaled, slow and unsteady. My uncle always said family was the foundation of power, he said, eyes still fixed on the screen. I never realized he meant control, not care. In executive offices across Manhattan, assistants stopped outside conference rooms where Whitmore board members had begun gathering in emergency calls. The company's stock ticker crawled in red beneath financial broadcasts. Analysts were no longer debating scandal. They were debating governance, fraud, and fiduciary concealment. But in the studio, the only thing that mattered was the little girl sitting beside the man who had just discovered his own bloodline had been filtered through board politics. Ava looked up at the envelope on the screen, then at Ethan. Did the old man not want me to find you? She asked in the simple, devastating language only a child could use. Ethan turned toward her, the question striking somewhere deeper than corporate betrayal. I think he wanted to protect the company, he said softly. Ava frowned, trying to make sense of a world where companies could matter more than people. But people are what makes stories, she said. The audience released a collective breath, the innocence of her logic exposing the cruelty of every decision made 5 years earlier. Nia's eyes flickered toward Ethan, and for the first time that night, there was something new beneath the steel of her composure. Not softness, recognition. He was finally feeling the scale of the silence she had survived. Vanessa's earpiece buzzed sharply. Another producer rushed to the side of the stage, her face pale with the thrill of fresh developments. She handed Vanessa a second tablet. We have another document, Vanessa said carefully, scanning it before lifting her gaze. A recorded board memo from the same week. It has just been leaked. The words sent a visible ripple through the control room. Damian Cross stepped closer from the wings, his expression sharpening as if he had expected the next move in this game of legacy. Vanessa read from the memo, each word cutting cleaner than accusation. Per Chairman Charles Whitmore, all personal correspondence related to Ethan Whitmore's Boston contact is to be archived under reputational risk and withheld until after succession vote. The studio gasped. Ethan's hand tightened around the arm of the chair, but his voice, when it came, was almost eerily calm. He classified Nia as risk. Nia's face remained still, but the hurt in the room changed shape. For 5 years, she had lived the consequences of being reduced to a file label in a boardroom she had never entered. No, she said quietly. He classified the truth as risk. The distinction landed harder than any outrage. Ethan turned fully toward her now, the live cameras catching the complete collapse of every protective narrative he had built around that lost week in Boston. I am sorry, he said, not as public relations, not as damage control, but with the quiet gravity of a man speaking to the cost of another person's years. Nia did not nod. She did not rescue him from the weight of it. An apology does not raise a child through fevers, school recitals, rent hikes, and questions I could not answer, she said, her voice low and even. But truth can. Still decide what happens next. The words reframed the room. This was not about forgiveness. It was about what truth demanded after exposure. Ethan looked at Ava, her silver stars catching the light like tiny verdicts. Then let it start now, he said. Not with lawyers. Not with private tests. With the one thing your uncle could never understand. Vanessa leaned forward. And what is that? Ethan's gaze moved from Ava to Nia, then directly into the camera lens that had once served as his shield. Presence. The word hung in the studio with astonishing force. Not money. Not settlements. Not corporate statements. Presence. Across the nation, social feeds exploded with the clip before he had even finished saying it. But the real shock arrived a second later when a black sedan appeared on the live split-screen feed outside Whitmore Global headquarters. Charles Whitmore himself was stepping out, flanked by legal counsel, heading toward the studio entrance under a storm of reporters and camera flashes. Vanessa's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "It appears your uncle is here." Ethan's expression hardened, not into anger, but into the unmistakable steadiness of a son of empire finally choosing truth over inheritance. Ava leaned against Nia's side, watching the screen with wide eyes. "Is he coming to say sorry too?" she asked. No one answered, because the deeper question had already taken hold of the nation. When Charles Whitmore walked onto that stage, would he protect the family name one last time, or would the little girl with silver stars force the final truth out into the open? The studio doors opened with a hush that somehow cut through the roar of millions watching. Every camera in the room turned before the operators were even told to move. Charles Whitmore stepped into the light with the composed gravity of a man who had spent 4 decades mastering the art of entering crises, as if he owned the ending. His silver hair was immaculate, his midnight suit pressed to precision, his expression carved into the same controlled calm shareholders had trusted through recessions, mergers, and family funerals. But tonight, the glow of the LED wall behind Ethan told a different story. CW was no longer a chairman's signature. It was a spotlight. Vanessa Cole rose slightly from her chair, her voice sharpened by the awareness that live television had crossed into history. "Charles Whitmore has joined us in studio." The audience sat frozen, not from fear, but from the electric awareness that this was the moment power usually disappeared behind legal statements and closed doors. Yet here he was, walking straight into the light. Charles's gaze moved first to Ethan, then to Nia, then finally to Ava. His eyes paused there for one fraction too long. "You should have handled this privately," he said, his tone calm, almost paternal, as if the nation were not listening. Ethan stood. The movement was slow, deliberate, and far more powerful than anger. "You made private impossible 5 years ago." For the first time, a visible shift touched Charles's expression. Not guilt, irritation, the kind that came when carefully managed history refused to stay filed. Vanessa turned toward him. "Did you withhold Ms. Brooks's letters and classify her as reputational risk?" Charles adjusted his cuff, a tiny gesture of old-world control. "I protected the company during a succession crisis. Whitmore Global employed 40,000 people at the time. One personal entanglement could have triggered a hostile acquisition." The studio reacted with stunned disbelief, but Nia remained still. Her dark skin caught the cold light with the same unshaken dignity she had carried all night. "I was not an entanglement," she said quietly. "I was a woman carrying the truth." Charles turned toward her, and for the first time the audience saw the architecture of the old empire clearly. "Miss Brooks, legacy requires difficult decisions." Ava's brows pulled together as she looked up at the older man. "You mean lies?" The room went silent in the way only innocence could command. Charles looked down at her, and something unreadable moved across his face. "Sometimes adults protect what children cannot understand," he said. Ava tilted her head, silver stars glinting under the lights. "Mommy says if a story starts with a lie, everybody gets lost." The audience exhaled in a soft wave. Ethan's eyes closed for the briefest second, because in that child's sentence was the simplest indictment of the Whitmore machine he had ever heard. Damian Cross, still near the wings, folded his arms with the stillness of a man watching an empire explain itself into collapse. Vanessa pressed forward. "Did you know there was a child involved?" Charles did not answer immediately, and in that pause the nation heard everything. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low, stripped of every executive cadence. "Answer her." Charles finally lifted his chin. "I knew there was a possibility." The words detonated harder than any raised voice could have. Nia's breath caught, not from surprise, but from the brutal confirmation of what loneliness had always whispered. Ethan stared at his uncle as if seeing him for the first time outside the architecture of family loyalty. "You knew," he said, the words hollow with disbelief. "And you still let her raise my daughter alone." Charles's calm thinned. "I let the future of this family survive." Ava looked from one man to the other, her small face serious in the giant wash of live television. Then she slipped free of Nia's hand and walked the 3 small steps toward Charles. No one moved. The cameras zoomed tighter. The little girl stopped in front of the patriarch of Whitmore Global and looked up with open, fearless eyes. "My teacher says family is the people who show up," she said softly. "Where were you?" It was not accusation. It was worse. It was truth without armor. Charles's face changed for the first time all night. Not collapse. Not confession. Something older. The sudden weight of a child measuring him by standards money had never taught. Across the nation, living rooms, airport gates, and office towers fell into the same stunned quiet. Ethan's expression hardened into something final. The man who had spent years inheriting power was now choosing whether to break from it. Vanessa's voice lowered to almost a whisper. "Mr. Whitmore, after hearing this, what do you intend to do?" Ethan looked at Ava, then Nia, then at the uncle who had shaped his empire and stolen his truth. When he spoke, the answer was not for the board, the markets, or even the cameras. It was for the child whose silver stars had brought the entire Whitmore legacy into the light. "I am going to tell the story exactly where it was broken," he said. And as Charles's legal counsel stepped nervously toward the stage with a sealed folder marked Board Confidential, America realized the real scandal had not even begun. The sealed folder in Charles Whitmore's counsel's hand changed the temperature of the room before anyone even touched it. Under the white blaze of the studio lights, the words "Board Confidential" stamped across the cover seemed less like legal protection and more like a gravestone for everything Ethan had believed about family stewardship. Vanessa Cole's eyes narrowed with the instinct of a journalist who knew the next 60 seconds could redraw the public memory of an empire. Charles remained standing in the center aisle, posture still immaculate, but the certainty in his face had begun to thin around the edges. For the first time that night, control was no longer flowing from him. It was moving toward the truth. Ethan stepped forward and took the folder from counsel before anyone could stop him. The room held its breath. He opened it slowly, the paper inside whispering against itself in the kind of silence that millions of people could somehow hear through a screen. On the top page was a board resolution dated 5 years earlier, the exact week of his father's stroke and the succession vote. Vanessa read over his shoulder, then lifted her gaze to the camera with disbelief sharpening every word. "This states that any personal matter involving Ethan Whitmore and future heirs outside approved legacy structure was to be suppressed until after merger stabilization." The audience gasped, but Nia Brooks did not move. Her stillness had become the axis of the entire night. Ethan's face hardened, not into rage, but into clarity. He flipped to the next page. A memorandum. Charles's signature. 3 board member approvals. One line underlined in red. If a child exists, all contact is to be deferred pending DNA and media risk assessment. Ava looked up at the giant screen as the network projected the document. For the nation to see. Her small voice cut through the legal language with devastating innocence. "They put me in a folder?" No analyst, no attorney, no chairman in history could have translated the cruelty of those words more clearly than the child they had tried to reduce to procedure. Ethan knelt beside her, bringing himself level with her eyes. "No," he said softly, voice thick with the truth of what he now understood. "They tried to put the truth in a folder. That is different." Nia watched him carefully. For the first time since stepping into the studio, she saw not just regret, but action beginning to take shape behind it. Charles finally spoke, his tone colder now that the architecture was exposed. "The board acted to preserve continuity. Markets punish instability. Legacy requires order." Damian Cross let out the faintest breath of disbelief from the wings. Vanessa did not let the moment pass. Order at the expense of a child knowing her father? Charles's jaw set. At the expense of timing. The answer landed like a confession wrapped in business language. Ethan rose slowly, folder still in hand, and turned toward the audience, toward the cameras, toward the city beyond the glass where Whitmore Global's tower pierced the Manhattan skyline. "This is what they taught me legacy meant," he said, holding up the file. A board vote over a heartbeat. A risk memo over a child. Silence dressed up as stewardship. The words were not loud, but they struck harder than any shouting could. In penthouses and break rooms across America, viewers watched the heir to one of the country's most powerful corporations publicly dismantle the moral vocabulary of his own dynasty. Ava stepped closer to Nia, silver stars flickering beneath the lights, then looked up at Ethan. "What happens to the folder now?" she asked. Ethan looked at the pages, then at Charles, then at the woman and child who had lived inside the consequences of every line. "Now," he said, "it becomes proof." He handed the file to Vanessa. The gesture was simple, but the symbolism was seismic. The truth was no longer in family hands. It belonged to the public record. Charles's counsel stepped forward, panic, finally breaking through professional restraint. "That document is privileged." Vanessa accepted the folder without blinking. "Not anymore," she said. Nia's gaze stayed on Ethan. "You said you would go back to where the story broke." Ethan nodded once, his eyes clear in a way they had not been all night. "Boston, the bookstore, the storm, the week they buried." The words changed the emotional gravity of the room. This was no longer about proving paternity or exposing a board. It was about reclaiming the original human truth before the empire translated it into risk language. Charles's expression darkened. "If you do this, you destroy the company your father built." Ethan turned toward him, steady and unshaken. "No, I destroy the lie built around it." Ava smiled faintly, as if she understood the difference better than any executive in the building. Vanessa looked directly into the lens, the sealed folder now resting openly on the desk. "Tomorrow morning, Ethan Whitmore says he is returning to Boston with Nia and Ava to revisit the place where this story truly began." Across the country, the nation leaned into the promise of what came next. Because somewhere in that snow-covered bookstore memory, hidden beneath coffee, old paper, and one forgotten week, was likely one final piece of proof no board resolution could erase. By sunrise, Boston wore the same kind of gray sky that had once changed everything. Snow clung in soft lines along the brownstones of Beacon Hill, and the narrow bookstore on Charles Street still stood exactly where memory had left it, its brass bell above the door catching the pale winter light. The nation had followed them there. Satellite vans lined the curb at a respectful distance, reporters speaking in hushed voices as if even the city understood this was no longer scandal. It was origin. Ethan Whitmore stood on the sidewalk for a long moment before stepping forward, his black wool coat dusted with snow, Ava's tiny gloved hand wrapped in his. Nia walked beside them, her dark camel coat elegant against the white morning, every movement carrying the same quiet dignity that had held steady under studio lights. But here, away from glass stages and legal folders, the air felt different. Older, truer. The bell chimed softly as they entered. Warmth, cedar shelves, and the scent of coffee and old paper folded around them like a preserved memory. Nothing about the place had changed except the years they had lost. Behind the front counter, Mrs. Eleanor Finch looked up from a stack of invoices. Her silver curls framed a face lined by kindness and time. The moment her eyes landed on Ethan, recognition moved through her like a door opening. "Well," she said softly, removing her glasses, "I wondered how long it would take for the storm to circle back." Ava looked up, delighted by the old woman's voice. "Do you know him too?" Mrs. Finch smiled gently. "I knew the man he was before the towers and boardrooms." Ethan's throat tightened. Nia said nothing. She simply walked toward the poetry shelf near the back window, the exact corner where the blizzard had trapped them for 3 nights 5 years earlier. The window still faced the same narrow ribbon of sky. Tiny stars always tell the truth. The phrase moved through Ethan's memory like snowfall. Mrs. Finch reached beneath the register and pulled out a faded blue ledger box. Nia froze the moment she saw it. The same blue, the same brass latch. "I kept this for whoever finally came back for the truth," Mrs. Finch said, setting it on the counter between them. Ethan stared. Inside lay the bookstore receipt from that storm week, the dried winter rose he had tucked into a book for Nia, and beneath it, something he had never known existed. A cassette tape, handwritten label in Nia's script. "Boston Snowstorm. Night 3. Ava's eyes widened. "Is that a story?" she asked. Mrs. Finch nodded. "The kind adults forget, and children somehow remember." Ethan's fingers trembled as he lifted the tape. Mrs. Finch pointed toward the old listening station by the back reading nook, a relic she had never replaced. He slid the cassette in, and the room filled with the soft, static warmth of recorded memory. Then his own younger voice emerged, unguarded, laughing in a way the public had never heard. "If we ever have a little girl," the voice said, "I want her to know the stars tell the truth, even when people are too afraid to." Nia closed her eyes. She had recorded it that night without telling him, not as leverage, not as proof, but because the moment had felt too human to trust to memory alone. Ava turned slowly toward Ethan, silver stars in her braids catching the bookstore light. "That is me," she whispered, wonder soft in her voice. Ethan dropped to one knee in front of her, the sound of his own forgotten hopes still echoing through the room. His eyes shone not with spectacle, but with the unbearable tenderness of recognition. "Yes," he said, voice breaking into the truth at last. "That is you." Outside, the cameras waited, but inside the bookstore, the world had narrowed to warmth, old paper, and a child finally hearing the story she had always belonged to. Nia stood beside the window, watching snow drift past the glass. She had not come here for revenge. She had come for proof that truth could survive time, boardrooms, and the cruelty of men who called children risk. Ethan rose and looked at her, then at Ava, then at the cassette still spinning softly in the machine. "I cannot change the years they stole," he said, "but I can make sure her future never answers to their fear." Mrs. Finch smiled as if the city itself had been waiting for that sentence. Ava slipped her small hand into Ethan's again and looked up through the window at the pale winter sky. "Mommy," she said, voice full of the simple certainty that had undone an empire. The stars brought him back. Nia's expression softened for the first time, not into surrender, but into peace. Outside, the live feeds captured the bookstore window glowing gold against the snow, the image already becoming America's new symbol of truth reclaimed. And as Whitmore Global stock began to recover not from damage control, but from the public's faith in honesty, the final shape of legacy became clear. It was never towers, votes, or sealed folders. It was presence. A father kneeling in the place where he had first imagined his daughter. A mother who chose dignity over spectacle. And a little black girl with silver stars in her hair who had turned a childhood phrase into the proof that rebuilt a family. In the same city where it was once quietly buried.